Let's now look at food web properties. When we want to understand the structure of food webs, we can focus on three main scales. The micro scale, which is the species level. We can look at how species are, for instance, central to the food webs. What are their properties? What are their commonalities or differences? We can also look at the meso-scale, which is an intermediate level between the species and the whole food web. Here we can look at small sets of 3 to 4 species, how these small groups of 3 or 4 species are organized. Finally, we can also look at the macro scale, at the whole network structure. What are the overall properties of the network, how we can describe it and compare it. Looking at the micro scale, we focus on very particular species. We can focus on each species or all of them, but the focus here again is on the nodes. A very basic property of a node is what it is called in jargon, its degree, which is basically how many species is connected to another species. It's answering the number of consumers and producers of a species. We can differentiate this degree in out degree, in degree, or normalized degree. The out degree is basically the number of links going out from a species, basically the number of its predators. The in degree is the number of links getting into the species, basically the number of its prey. In this case, the out degree is 2 for the sales, and the in degree is 16. The normalized degree is just the degree divided by the total number of possible species with whom the species can interact. In this case, it is 18 divided by 29. This provides a very basic information, but can already tell a lot about the position of a species. Then there is what we call the generalization. It is attempting to describe generalist, answering to the question, how many different resources does a species consume? We can see, for instance, sharks and squid are quite generalist species. They feed on a very broad set and range of prey. This is important because if we want to understand, for instance, the consequences, the impact of a policy for fisheries, we have also to look at how those species are generalist. Because if we want to reduce or increase a particular species, we have to consider that if the target species is a generalist, then this may require more effort than for a specialist species. Then we can also look indeed at the specialization, which is on the other side of the gradient. A specialist is a very narrow niche species, and it attempts to answer in the question how resource use is similar to its availability. A very specialized species, for instance, in this case the anchovy, is feeding on a narrow set of resource availables. Another important property of a species is its vulnerability. It had answered to the question, what is the ability of resource taxa to defend against consumer? You can imagine that this is also very important for policymakers and for applied questions, because if our target species that we want to conserve is quite vulnerable, then we have to pay more attention than for a less vulnerable species. In this case, the vulnerability is reflecting somehow the resistance, the robustness of a species to having other predators increasing in their abundance. Finally, we can focus on a very important property for species, which is the centrality. And this is indeed indicating how important is a species, how central it is in the network. There are many ways of calculating centrality. We will focus here on two widespread and common properties called betweenness and closeness. If we look at the seals and the lanternfish here, we can represent the betweenness centrality as the number of species that stand between each other. So in this case, the betweenness is the number of shortest path a species is involved in. There is a shortest path between every pair of species. In this case, for instance, the seals and the lanternfish are not directly connected, but there can be a minimum distance that is the number of trophic links necessary to go from one species to another. The more a species is included within possible shortest paths of a food web, the higher its importance. Similarly, closeness centrality is also based on shortest path, but instead it is looking at the average shortest path length between a species and all the other species. So it indicates the distance to other species, how close it is. So summarizing, betweenness centrality focus on how a species is located between two other species. The closeness centrality instead indicates how a species is close to all other species. We can then look at the meso-scale, what we call motifs. Motifs are recurring significant patterns of interconnections. They are subgraphs comprising 3 or 4 species that occur more often in empirical food webs than in the random counterparts. It is very important to notice this definition. So motifs comprise 3 species as they are depicted here, but not all groups of 3 species are motifs. Indeed, for such a subset, for such a subgraph, for being a motif, it's very important that they are overrepresented than what we would expect by random expectation. There are more motifs than what would be expected out of chances. So we will now look at the main motifs that have been identified to be recurring, to being overrepresented in food webs. The basic one is so-called a simple food chain. In this case, a prey is at the same time a predator which is feeding on 2 different species. This is indicated as on the right by a food chain composed by phytoplankton, the goby, and the sharks. We can see here that these simple food chains are actually extremely numerous in food webs, and indeed they are a fundamental building block of food webs. Another classic motif is the so-called omnivory. In this case, as we can see here, we have a generalist predator that is feeding on two preys. In turn, one of these two preys is feeding on the other prey. This is the case, for instance, between sharks, birds, and the seal, where the shark is feeding over birds and seals, and in turn, birds and seals birds are feeding on seals. This is very important to understand because this is a classic motif that generates stability. This type of interconnections between among three species is very important to stabilize the food webs. Indeed, they are very common, and this type of feeding behavior is overrepresented. We observe this type of interactions more than we would expect just by random expectation, just by taking all species in a community and drawing random links among them. Another quite important motif is what is called exploitative competition. In this case, we have two predators feeding on the same prey. For instance, as we can see on the right, we have birds and whales and dolphins that are feeding on round herring. Here, we can see another very important concept in food webs, which is the indirect effect. So even though birds and whales are not directly interacting with each other, there is no link, direct feeding interaction between birds and whales, yet the changes in abundance of birds can increase or decrease the change in abundance of birds, and vice versa. In the same time, a fluctuation in the population of herring is going to impact both birds and whales in such a way that we can see as if those two species are competing for exploiting the same resource. Hence, from here the name exploitative competition. We can imagine that if we increase or if by its own the population of whales is going to increase over a certain threshold, this is going to affect birds in such a way that their population is likely going to decrease, and vice versa. A somehow analogous but opposite motif is that of apparent competition. In this case, we have two preys that are preyed by the same predator, as for instance is the case of tuna and whales and dolphins, which are predated by sharks. Analogous to the previous motif, here there is no link between the two preys, but it may appear that thanks to the indirect effects propagating through the food web, and particularly through this motif, tuna and dolphin may appear as if they are competing, because an increase, for instance, in the population of tuna is going to increase the population of sharks. You can predict that an increase in population of sharks may in turn affect negatively the population of whales and dolphins. So we will see that this type of indirect interaction may lead to an apparent competition between the two preys. Another overrepresented, widespread, and central motif comprising four species is what is called a biparallel. It is represented here, for instance, on the right, including a shark, anchovies and plickard, and the mesozooplankton. In this case, this includes two preys that consume the same resources and are predated by the same predator. This is quite important because somehow it encapsulates, it resembles the two previous motifs that we observed, that are exploitative competition and apparent competition. In this case, the dynamics are going to be quite complicated because the two preys are going to interact indirectly through different pathways. In particular, they can change each other population abundance through changing their common predator or their common prey. We will look in our practical class how we can build algorithm and understand how those motifs are really the basic building blocks and their consequences for the stability of ecosystems.